A few things you want to have a look for when you're getting into the car to go for a test drive is that when you turn the key on, all your lights turn on. Now in the case of this car, I am missing one of my lights over here. There should be a little green light that indicates that the parking lamps are on or functioning, and you want the lights to go out after the key's been on for a little bit. Obviously right now I haven't started the motor yet. A couple things to pay attention to is the check engine light here and the battery light that's over here. And the reason I mention having a look at those is because you want to make sure when you start the car that that check engine light goes out, and you also want to make sure that this battery light goes out once the car is running. Now in my case it's still on. That's telling me that the alternator isn't charging properly, which is a common issue with these cars. So I know just by that light, okay, I'm gonna be into replacing the alternator on this car. Something to pay attention to. But you notice that my other lights have gone out. Another one that I do want to point out, just because sometimes it can be important, is this little light here that has the little steering wheel with a little exclamation mark. So the upper trim level 451s have electronically power assisted steering. Now this light's on right now. You notice that it went out once I started the car up, but sometimes that light will come on if the steering column U-joint gets really sticky. So if you're driving the car and the steering feels like it's notchy, like you're turning the wheel and it feels smooth and then it binds up at one spot and then becomes smooth again, binds up and then becomes smooth again, there's a chance that that will illuminate that light. And that doesn't mean necessarily that there's something wrong with the power steering system. It just means that it's getting funny readings. So sometimes that can be solved just by lubricating that U-joint. So just something to keep in mind. But in my case, car starts up, I had oil pressure, check engine light went out, so I know that the motor's running, okay. And but like you saw, the battery light was on, so I know I'm going to be changing the alternator. One more thing I want to mention about the dash here, if you have a look when I turn that key on, you've got this yellow triangle in the middle with the exclamation mark. That's a warning light for your traction control system. So if you take the car for a spin and that light stays on, it means that you have an issue with your traction control system, and that could be a costly repair, or it could be very simple depending on what the issue is. But keep an eye out for that. Usually it'll be accompanied by the brake light and the ABS light, which are down here, if it's an issue with a speed sensor or something like that. Common issue on these cars, the rear speed sensor signal rings crack and give you that light when there's a problem with that. Something else to pay attention to on the dash here when you turn the key on, if down here in the left hand corner you see a wrench or a couple of wrenches flashing when you first start the car or turn the ignition on, and then the trip odometer there where it's right now saying 0.0, if that was replaced by -800, that could mean that the car is 800 miles or kilometers overdue for service, or if it says like -21 days over service. So if those wrenches are flashing and you have some absurd number there in terms of how far overdue you are for maintenance, it doesn't necessarily mean that the car hasn't been maintained, because that counter has to be reset by doing a special procedure. But it could be an indication that the car hasn't been maintained properly. So if you see those service wrenches there, just ask the owner when you're checking the car out, when was the last time they had service done, and if they have documentation for it. A couple other things you want to just check is to make sure that your blower fan works at all the different speeds. It speeds up as you go up higher and then shuts off, and that it's not super noisy. You can check and make sure that your stereo works as well. Also check your heated seats if you want. Better to do that while the car's running, just so that you're not draining the battery with them on. And if you turn your headlights on, turn your fog lights on, which is right here, then you can go outside and have a look and see and make sure that all your lights are working properly. So I've got the ignition on and the headlights turned on, as well as the fog lights. You can see that both my fog lights are on, and so are both my low beam headlights. One thing you'll notice, this headlight here, you might be able to see the projector housing is actually dropped in the inside that little silver ring. That piece of glass should be centered and it's not. And that's one little issue that this car has. It looks like I found evidence that there's a little bit of damage in the front end here from a crash, maybe because the paint here has been redone. Another thing to notice, this parking bulb here is burnt out. Really common for that to happen on these. You can see on the other side here it's working properly. So that's something just to check for, because if you have burnt out bulbs, those can be kind of tricky to change. Now you can go in and turn on your high beams. You'll see my high beam light comes up. And when we come around here to check, now I've got my high beams working on both sides as well, so that's a good thing. Next thing we're going to check, I'm going to turn those off, and I'm just going to check and make sure that all my turn signals work. So you can see I've got one signal on the side here, it's working. Turn signal in this headlight housing is working. So is the one in this headlight housing. This side working as well. And you can see here, got that turn signal working. Now my left side isn't. So I know I'm gonna have to do a change to one of the bulbs there. Next thing I'm gonna do is check the parking lights. So just by turning on that parking light, I can see I've got a parking light working over here on the right, nothing working here on the left. So again, that bulb is burnt out. Next thing you want to check is to make sure that your brake lights are working. I've improvised a little bit here because I don't have a helper right now. So I've just wedged something in there on the brake, and then I can come back and have a look at my brake lights. As you can see, I've got one working over here. Again, on my left, that one's not working. Same thing as the turn signal, and my third brake light here isn't working either, which isn't going to pass the safety in my part of the country, so I'm going to have to replace that. Super common for those ones to go out. One thing you do want to look for with this third brake light is have a look at your hardware that holds it on. It's really common for these screws to get all rusted and to start coming apart. You can see this one, the screw's already out of it, so it's loose on that side. This side, it looks like the original screw, but sometimes people try and improvise stuff because they break the stock screws off, so they'll have wood screws holding this in or something like that. So if you're checking the car out and you see a couple of wood screws in there, just know that you might have a bit of a challenge getting that apart, and keep that in mind when you're talking about price with the seller. And then I'm going to check the reverse lights. Now obviously my car is not running, I just have the ignition on, so I can put that in reverse because I have the helper holding my brake pedal. And we come back and have a look. As you can see, I've got my reverse light working properly on this side. On this side, the bulb is working, but it looks like I've got a mouse nest in there, so I'll have to clean that out. Now you also want to make sure that your wipers are working properly, and you'll find the control for that just over here. I'm not going to turn mine on because the car is filthy and it's just going to put some scratches in the windshield, but just make sure you flick that on and make sure the wipers are working properly. Now there's a couple quick checks you can do under the hood of your smart car, and the way you get that hood off is you have a couple plastic latches here, so you want to make sure those are working properly too, but basically turn them out, pop the hood, and then to remove it you're just going to pull it straight towards you, and then you can, normally there's a little strap that holds this hood on, but you can hang it. I've got a couple little, if you can see right in here, a couple little spots where you can hang that hood if you want to. So now under the hood, we're going to take a look at the coolant bottle here. You can see that my coolant level is quite low. It's under the minimum. There's your two markings here, but you can also see that the coolant is sort of a dark bluish color. That is the color of the original coolant that came in the car, so there's a good chance that this car just has never been checked, never been topped off, never had the coolant flushed or anything like that, so it's probably just lost a little bit of coolant over the years. It is good to see that it's got the correct color of coolant in it. This dark blue color, or I've also seen European coolant that's like a pale yellow. So if it's a pale yellow color, that could be just an aftermarket coolant that's been replaced. But you want to check and see if it's got that fluorescent green Prestone sort of color, only because if it does have that fluorescent green coolant in it, there's a chance that the car's had an issue with the heating system, or with the the radiator cooling system, or the head gasket, and that somebody's done some repairs, replaced the coolant with something that isn't the correct coolant. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with the car, but it's just something you want to check. And if it's got the incorrect coolant in it, it could be that the job was rushed or done improperly, or done somewhere that didn't know how to do the job properly, or didn't know to use the correct coolants. So it's one little flag maybe against the quality of the car that you're buying. Another thing I like to check with these 451 specifically is that the dust caps on the headlights are still in place. A lot of times, so you've got these two rubber dust caps. Here's the one for the high beam, and then you've got one back here for the low beam. And a lot of times what happens is guys remove them when they're changing the bulbs, but they drop them down behind because they're not attached to anything. And when that happens, if that cap gets dropped, or if it doesn't get reinstalled properly, is that you get a lot of dust getting into the headlight housing, and that dust will end up on the back of your headlight lens, like your projector lens, and make that really dirty, and then you get really poor headlight performance. So a lot of times people complain about the headlights on these cars being very poor, and then when you pull the hood off, you see that the dust cap has fallen off, and it means that you've got to pull this headlight out and clean everything really well to get that headlight performance back. Now on this car in particular, we can see some more damage right here, some damage repairs rather from a front end collision, to go with that headlight that's out of place. So with those checks done, we can put our hood back in. Now you want to make sure that these two tabs, you've got one tab on either side, and you've got a slot on either side that they fit into. You want to make sure that those tabs go back into those slots, and that also makes sure, because there's a little bit of an alignment rail on the side there, it'll make sure that that goes in properly, and that you're able to slide the hood down into its proper position and then lock it in place with those tabs. Something you can have a real quick look at is on the underside of the car. Just have a peek, and you can see that on this car I've still got all my plastic belly pans. It should be completely covered from the front bumper all the way back to the motor. If you're missing some of those panels, it could be an indication that somebody had them off to do some work and didn't reinstall them, or that the car got damaged somehow. So just keep an eye out for that, because if you are missing some of these panels, it just means that more dirt and dust and salt and all that kind of stuff can get up into the internals of the underside of the car and corrode some of the metal parts under there. Around here at the back of the car, a couple things to check. You can make sure that your hatch release works properly, that your struts are strong enough to keep the hatch open. These fail, lose their pressure a lot of the time, and you'll have a hatch that doesn't hold open. So you can just make sure that that is working properly, and that you can get into your storage area properly. Make sure that that works. And this car's had a reverse camera installed. There's no screen on the inside of the car, so that's probably just going to get removed. Now, at the bottom of the car, I've got a Brabus, so it's got the center exit exhaust. Most cars will have the exit for the exhaust down here and just a blank panel. Something to check for when you're going to look at a car is just to have a look at, on the left-hand side here, if you have a look, you can see that there's a flex pipe just right here. Now this one's not in the best condition, so that'll probably need to be cut out and replaced before I can drive the car, because it's going to start to leak very soon. A lot of the times that'll already have been replaced once or twice. This one's already been replaced. Now, the telltale for a flex pipe failure normally will be like that this panel at the back here will have a little divot melted out of it just about there. So if you're going to check a car out and you can see that it has the little divot melted out, and the exhaust pipe isn't touching the bumper, then you know that it has failed and has been replaced. Have a look at it to see the quality of the repair. And if you don't have that little divot here, then you know that it's probably on the original flex pipe. Otherwise, if the little bit of tailpipe is sitting against the bumper here, have a look at the exhaust system, because that flex pipe is probably still broken, and you'll be able to move that tip in and out. And of course, you'll hear the exhaust leak as well. So something to keep an eye out for, because by now anything that's up to 2012 will have failed by now probably, and is something that you need to keep an eye out for. The mufflers for these things, if you want to purchase a muffler to replace that system, they're very expensive. So that's something to know before you purchase the car, whether that flex pipe has been replaced or what kind of condition it's in, because if it's not in good condition and hasn't been replaced, you will for sure need to replace that very soon. And you can take it to a muffler shop. They might be able to just cut out the flex pipe and weld a new one in, like what's been done to this car. And if not, you're going to be looking at a whole new muffler, which is, like I say, very expensive. Up here they're $500 to $600, so something to keep in mind when you're discussing price. Now if you want to have a look at the motor, fairly easy to get at. You just pop your hatch and then open your tailgate, pull this little bit of carpet up, and then you can just pop that little lock, and you can get under the hood of the car, so to speak. Now, in terms of if you're looking at a car, you could check the oil here, but you're not going to be able to see many issues just from here, because it is so difficult to see all the components. Everything's very tight in this engine bay. So, in my case, that alternator's failed, and you can see that it looks pretty crusty. But in terms of mechanical issues, it's going to be very difficult to spot anything like this. The only thing would be if you could hear a strange noise, you could maybe pop the hood and see if you can figure out where that's coming from. One issue that these cars do have fairly frequently is with the secondary air injection pump, and it's tucked in right over here. You won't be able to see it very easily, but that pump runs on cold starts, and if it just to help with the emission system. So if you start the car and that secondary air injection pump isn't functioning, which is very, very common with these cars, it'll throw a check engine code or a check engine light up on the dash. So when you're taking the car for a test drive, have a peek, make sure that check engine light isn't on. If it is on, and if the person's had it diagnosed and the secondary air injection pump is an issue, they can be kind of expensive to replace, so keep an eye out for that as well. A couple more things to maybe have a quick look at if you're checking a car out at the back of the car here is just to have a look underneath and have an eye on this oil filter, see if it looks new or if it looks like this one, fairly old and corroded. Another thing that you want to have a look for is your springs. So your rear springs are just right here, and you can see this one's been broken, and same issue over here on this side. You can see that coil is broken, so obviously some big problems with this car. In terms of the rear suspension, those springs will definitely have to be replaced. Try and get in if you're looking at purchasing a car and have a peek at the springs and see if you can see any broken springs. Usually at the top or at the bottom you'll see like a rough edge on the spring if a piece has broken off and fallen away. So just try and have a peek at the top and at the bottom where they're sitting on the suspension there, and see if you can spot a rough edge that would indicate that the spring was broken. Very common failure on these cars, and something you want to keep an eye out because it can be a costly repair. So I'm lucky I've got the car off the ground here. I can just do a quick check and see if I have any play or looseness left to right and top to bottom that could indicate a failed wheel bearing, or my control arm bushings. If they had failed, I would get a bit of play sort of in this direction. Normally I'd give the wheel a spin and listen to that wheel bearing, but these brakes have been sitting for quite a while, and are pretty rusted up, so I've got a lot of noise from that front end. Once I get the wheel off, take the brake caliper off and remove that rotor, I'll just give that wheel bearing a spin by hand and check it that way. In the back here, you can do the same and just check for play in that wheel bearing in the back. The suspension's quite a bit simpler back here, so not really worried about bushings so much, but if the wheel bearing's gone, you'll get a little bit of play there. Another thing to pay attention to is your tire wear. The smart cars do have quite a bit of camber built into them, so when this thing's sitting on the ground, those wheels are actually tilted in a little bit at the top. So if you're having a look at your tires, you'll notice typically they have a lot more wear on the inside edge than on the outside edge. So if you're just walking around the car, you look, you know, right here and you say, oh, this thing's got good tread still, but you might come back, have a look at the inside edge and realize that it's just about bald on the inside edge. So make sure you have a look, you know, not just at the outside edge from here, but that you have a look from the front and from the back at the inside edge of the tire, because they wear out significantly quicker on that edge. You might buy the car, get it home or get it to your mechanic and find out that you're in for a set of 4 new tires, which can be a significant cost. Some other mechanical issues that these cars have that you want to have a look for in the maintenance records to see if they've been dealt with is the alternator, because they do tend to go out fairly frequently, so you want to see if that alternator's been replaced and if the battery's been replaced. Like in the case of this car, you know, obviously I've got it hooked up to a charger here because the alternator had failed and it killed the battery. So just have a look in the maintenance records to see if that stuff's been replaced. Another thing that's very common with these cars is what people call crazing on the panoramic roofs. So as you have a look here, you can kind of see that it's all speckled, and that's actually the outside of the roof that's deteriorated a little bit. It's a plastic panel, so it does deteriorate with the sun and all that kind of stuff, and it gives you that sort of speckly pattern there. Not anything that bothers me, but if that's a big deal for you, if you're checking a car out and they have the shade closed, you might not notice it, but have a look for it. They can replace this panel. I've never had one done because it doesn't really bother me that much, but if you have that crazing and it bothers you, there's not very much you can do short of replacing that panel to correct it. Another thing to check is the function of your rear wiper, because these do fail fairly often. And you turn that on with the car running or the key to the on position, you just move that wiper stalk towards the front of the car and it'll turn on that rear wiper. I'm not going to do it right now because the car is filthy, and if I try to turn that wiper on, it's just going to turn my back window into an old vinyl record here. So I'm going to check that later once I've got the car cleaned off and have looked at that wiper blade, probably replaced it. But that's something else to keep in mind when you're checking the car out. So that pretty much covers the sort of common issues with the 451 generation Smart ForTwo. Now, I'm not a mechanic, so I can't tell you everything that you'll have to look for, everything that's going to be looked at in a safety inspection or anything like that. But hopefully this video gives you a few ideas, things to look for when you're going to shop for a car. If nothing else, you know, if you're looking for your car and you take that list of things that we've talked about, it'll give you a little bit more leverage when you're negotiating a price. If it's got some issues, some of the common stuff, you'll at least know, you'll be prepared, and you'll be able to have a little bit of an idea what those costs for repairs might be, so you can negotiate that price down a little bit and maybe get a little bit better deal on your new smart car.